All right, we are rolling here with another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. We're here with Sam Knowlton, who is the founder of soilsymbiotics, which is a regenerative agriculture advisory firm. And we're excited to have Sam here today. Sam, what's going on?
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, so we're excited to have you on because we know you bring the boots on the ground experience when it comes to advising a lot of farms. I know from reading your website, you've advised over 200 farms and worked on 9 different continents, or is it 9 countries?
Countries, yeah.
9 countries. There aren't even 9 continents. And so, we were just excited to get your experience and your perspective because clearly you've been doing a ton of work. And I think a lot of people are becoming aware of what's happening in regenerative agriculture, but you've been doing it for so long that you have just so much experience and come into contact with so many different people. So maybe a good place to start would just be your backstory, how you got into it, and what you're doing now. I think that would really just like add some context and color to the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so I have a background in ecology. That's what I studied in college. And, it was something even going back to high school that I was really interested in. And I think it was pretty fundamental in giving me kind of a whole systems context for looking at, land, ecosystems, agriculture. And through ecology, I found my way to permaculture when I was about 20 years old, and really dove into that and found it to be fascinating. And one of the first things that I found that was really full of hope, because there's so much kind of doom and gloom out there in terms of the environment, agriculture, etc. But permaculture I felt was really practical, principle-based approach to regenerating landscapes and really communities. Really has a broad scope. So I did that for a while. I taught permaculture design courses and worked kind of on a smaller scale. Did a number of agroforestry projects early on. Was involved in a lot of reforestation efforts in Central America that were kind of agroforestry based. And then at a certain point, I kind of realized that I wanted to see how I could get involved in larger acreage, larger projects, and really saw soil and, particularly soil microbiology, plant nutrition as a really strong leverage point in doing that. So I really dove into that that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years. And basically gathered up a great kind of team of mentors and teachers and, people like Neil Kinsey, Don Huber, Elaine Ingham, and lots of other kind of lesser known folks that had a really big impact on the way I see things and kind of the technical aspect of agriculture and what I see as regenerative agriculture. So that led me to work with a lot of big agriculture companies, mostly in the specialty crops category, fruits and vegetables, but also some grain, some pasture, stuff like that as well. So that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 12 years or so, like I said, and here I am.
For those who aren't as well versed in some of the language when it comes to regenerative agriculture, when you talk about agro, you said agro, I'm blanking on the exact word that you used, agroforestry, sorry. What exactly is that, and how does it play into the bigger picture of regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, so there's a number of different schools of agroforestry, and really the way I see it is agroforestry is mimicking the structure and the function of the forest as a agricultural system. So and then kind of on the simpler side, it's basically just incorporating useful tree crops, multifunctional tree crops into agricultural fields.
Mm.
So, I work with a lot of coffee and cacao, and those are um, really best grown in agroforestry systems because coffee and cacao are shade loving trees. That's kind of their ecological niche.
Mm.
So they do best with shade, which, if designed properly, can be high value trees, fruits, uh, high value timber, stuff like that, that brings an additional revenue stream and, kind of some redundancy to the system in terms of yield.
Got it. And if you were to be explaining to someone who's just coming across regenerative agriculture and wanting to learn more, what would be your basic guiding principles of how to explain it to them? And what are the key things that they should know about regenerative agriculture?
Yeah. Um, I think, kind of based on the way I see it now, kind of entering the mainstream and a lot of people talking about it, I would first start by saying that it's very context dependent,
Mm.
because I think a lot of people see regenerative agriculture as a set of practices or tactics, or as that it's grazing basically.
Right.
I think that's a lot of people's window into regenerative agriculture, and really it's context dependent, and it should be a biological based system.
Mm.
So or at least tending towards that. I mean, a lot of times in my world, I'm having to start where people are at currently, and some of
Right.
these big farming operations are just due to the mainstream paradigm, are very reliant on synthetic chemicals and herbicides, pesticides, etc. So starting to wean people off that and have a more biological based system, which over time will create more disease resistance, pest resistance, more complexity, more richness in the system overall. So that's kind of the first part.
Yeah. So I guess to try to translate that into my own terms, what you're saying is create these systems in all these different climates, so it's the context is key, where you're not going to be applying the same principles in the middle of Kansas as you would in some of these Latin American countries, but the core principle, and I think you mentioned this in one of your blog posts, first principles thinking, is you're trying to create biodiversity that can create resiliency at a very fundamental level when it comes to growing crops and raising livestock in some cases. Does that
Yeah.
jive with what
Yeah.
you describe?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the core principle right there.
Yeah.
So what that's going to look like in practice is going to be very different. And that's where the kind of context dependence comes in.
Yeah.
Is like you mentioned, in Kansas, that might look like one thing. In on a coffee farm in Latin America, it's going to look like something else.
Right.
And sometimes it'll look the same, but I think that's one place where I differ a little bit, is that I'm open to most tools that are available to us if it's going to nudge us in the right direction, or if
Mm.
it's going to pull one of these levers that's a leverage point to really catapult the system forward.
Yeah.
So creating a biological based system really is a lot about the soil and the soil microbiology, and really getting that whole flywheel moving, which cycles nutrients, which builds water holding capacity in the soil, which offers disease and pest protection to the plants. And I think there's a lot of talk in regenerative agriculture about things like cover crops, things like no-till,
Mm-hmm.
and I've had quite a bit of experience where we've actually done some tillage, especially early on, and that's been key to really moving the systems forward towards a biological system, towards
Mm.
more, richness and complexity in terms of soil life. And that's, runs counter to what most
Right.
people in regenerative agriculture are talking about. But there's, in order to get the biology really functioning, we have to look at the physical nature of the soil as well as the mineral nature of the soil. And
Right.
the more we can improve the physical aspect of the soil, and the more we can kind of balance nutrients and minerals in the soil, the better the biology in the soil is going to work. So
Right.
sometimes it requires, moving in one of those directions first. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the role you're describing really does demand a dynamic way of thinking where you're not going to be able to just take like a cookie cutter approach to everything. I'm curious what you've seen on the front lines just in terms of regenerating the soil and getting it back, bringing it back to life. What are some of the benefits that you've seen in these ecosystems once you've spent a few years really putting in the work?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to think of like a starting place, like one crop. So I've worked with a lot of tomatoes and peppers, cucumbers, kind of that classification of specialty crop. And one of the things that we've seen is just a major decrease in disease and pest pressure.
Mm.
That was kind of the first thing that happened.
And what do you attribute that to specifically with like some of the tactics that you were using?
So I think really it comes down to mineral nutrition
Mm.
and the plant nutrition
Yeah.
specifically. So when a plant has proper nutrition, it's going to be much more resistant to disease and pests just
Mm.
on its own, because all these different minerals, especially trace minerals, but the macronutrients as well, are all catalysts for different metabolic functions within the plant. So when the
Mm.
plant has, and you could think of them as like a key to an ignition,
Right.
these catalysts. So when it's got the key to the ignition, it can, turn it on and defend itself from diseases and pests. And when those are missing from the system, it creates a cascading effect where, more and more kind of there's a log jam of
Right.
functions within the plant that aren't happening.
Right.
So that's kind of the um, low hanging fruit, and that's usually where I start with a system is
Mm.
look at the mineral aspect, nutrition, and really start to improve that. And that can be through mineral amendments, foliar applications, and that at least the way that we do it, it goes hand in hand with increasing the biological activity. Because
Mm.
another aspect of increased nutritional integrity, better nutritional integrity in a plant is higher rates of photosynthesis.
Mm.
And a result of photosynthesis is the generation of these sugar exudates that plants produce and pump them out into the root zone,
Right.
which feed the biology. So if a plant's photosynthesizing at a higher rate, that system really kickstarts and we get much more biological activity. So that's kind of the plant nutrition aspect. And then there's, an increase in organic matter is pretty much always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's also going to, increase the biological activity in the soil, improve the structure. You'll have less compaction, which is the cause of lots of diseases in plants. And, the soil will hold water at a much better rate.
And when you say organic matter, could you break that down just in layman's terms and sort of how you guys go about getting more organic matter into the soil? Because I know there's a lot of really compelling data around water retention when it comes to more organic matter in the soil. And obviously it helps these plants be able to grow and thrive once you can restore it.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, it's what people also refer to as soil carbon, and it's, I mean, one of the more stable forms is comes from these plant root exudates. It's also added commonly through compost applications, uh, cover crops. Not only the actual green material that's typically incorporated into the soil,
Mm,
but also the living roots. So usually, those are kind of the typical ways of increasing organic matter: cover crops, compost. Um, but like I was just talking about, a really overlooked aspect are these plant root exudates, and
mm,
it's kind of like you hear people talk about how healthy plants come from healthy soil, but
right.
it's really healthy plants that are creating a healthier soil through these plant root exudates.
Right.
Um, so yeah,
One of the things I saw on your blog that I found interesting, and it's one of the things that I was actually drawn to about regenerative agriculture, is the mineral deficiency. And you were speaking about it a little bit earlier, but there was this article that you tagged from University of Texas talking about plants from 1950 versus plants in 1999, and how the mineral content in those plants is way different. It's much more diluted, or just not even, I think it was like 6 to 36% less than what it was in a 50-year time frame. I'm curious what minerals are you looking for when you're looking at like a healthy soil sample, and how quickly can you guys get in there and fix some of those mineral deficiencies? Because obviously, with the world of health that I'm interested in, if people are eating plants and animals that are less mineral, less minerally strong, then they clearly need to fortify that some way in their diet. And I just think it's an astounding statistic that the food that we're eating is so significantly impaired from what it used to be.
yeah, um, yeah. I think for me, that's really the most important thing in all of this. And as a result of kind of the industrial agriculture approach to higher and higher yields, more and more chemical dependency, um, and breeding efforts to create hybrids that um, just grow faster and yield more.
Mm,
This is kind of the situation that we've created for ourselves, and I think this is another aspect that's really missing from the regenerative agriculture conversation, is the quality outcome. And really, if we're not producing higher quality crops with more nutritional integrity, I don't think it's regenerative agriculture.
yeah.
And part of what's missing is a way of really measuring that. Um, but there's a lot of science that points to flavor and how flavor is connected to uh, nutritional integrity in the plant.
Yeah.
And I think that's one starting point, and that's something that I've seen. That's one of the other. You asked me about kind of what results I've seen in the field, and that's another one. In the tomatoes and peppers and those crops, um, really the flavor has changed dramatically,
Mm,
and the shelf life has changed dramatically. So now they're able to actually harvest those crops at a much later stage. Usually they're, like a tomato, for example, is harvested green, or
right.
slightly darker than green, and then shipped out. But they're able to harvest red tomatoes and ship them, and they've got a longer shelf life and much more flavor.
Mm.
um, and that's kind of what led me to work with other crops like grapes and coffee particularly, where flavor is really a big deal, and those crops are compensated based on flavor.
It's so interesting. Where does GMO fit into all of this? Is that something that you come into contact with in your line of work?
Um, I don't so much. And part of that is because I work mostly with specialty crops,
Mm,
and most of the grain, which are the GMO crops. I'm working with organic farms. Um, so I'm not in favor of GMO crops,
yeah,
and I think the it's one of those things where for years I read lots and lots about the arguments for GMOs just to better understand it, and the arguments against GMOs, and they're basically saying the same thing. They're making the same argument,
right,
and I think it's very confusing for people. I guess where I come from it is like, why why jump to that if we haven't figured out the basics yet? You know, like we haven't figured out soil health, we haven't figured out plant nutrition. Why are we jumping so far ahead to this kind of technological fix
right,
if we haven't even figured out the basics?
right,
Um, and we can see that with kind of the green revolution, and the increase in synthetic chemical use and all these hybrid varieties, is we really kind of skipped far ahead, and now that's exactly what's coming back to bite us in terms of the nutritional integrity of our food. And
right,
there's so many, you mentioned your interest in health, so many of the chronic diseases that cost billions of dollars each year to treat are nutritionally linked. So
yeah.
um I'm just kind of in general of that philosophy. Let's get the basics down and see where that takes us, and then get into the technological fixes if that's necessary.
Yeah, that totally resonates with me. And obviously now we're living in this complex global system. I'm curious, does the basics to you look more like a local food system, a more locally focused food system? Because I do feel like with a lot of the concepts around regenerative agriculture, it is really about restoring the soil locally and creating food systems that can be supported, or that you can support like the local economy. Like that I think that does kind of satisfy this idea of figuring out the basics. Like each area should have a sound local food system, and then if we need to support other regions through global trade, like I think that's obviously a very important thing in terms of food stability. But it seems like we've lost touch with a lot of this idea of just going up the street and buying food from your local farmer in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah, I think I absolutely agree with that, and that's kind of, I'm in this interesting space because I kind of came at this from um, the permaculture world, from ecology, and kind of these smaller kind of bioregional systems,
Mm,
and then launched into working with these big uh, agribusiness companies. And I really see, I don't think that we're going to get away from the large scale farming anytime soon.
yeah,
So I think it's really important that we make um, this kind of regenerative agriculture approach accessible to those farms and show them the value. And I think there is a lot of value. It's often, the conversation usually looks a little bit different. The kind of I see a lot of dogma and a lot of platitudes in regenerative agriculture these days, and that doesn't
right.
work. But there
Yep.
are other aspects like increased shelf life uh, that's appealing to these farms. Um, and so I see that aspect of it, and I see the importance of it. And then also, my heart is really in kind of the smaller, diverse, bioregional uh, farms. I mean, I love that. I think um, it's just beautiful, and I think that's an important aspect of agriculture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. What do you think is important for consumers to know? Because in my opinion, I think most people are incredibly well intentioned when they're coming to try to make their food decisions. A lot of people have constraints around budget and things like that. But if they're trying to make the right decision. I think they actually, I think they want to, but there's so much information out there that steers them in different directions. Is there a few things from your perspective that people should be aware of?
Um, I think getting to know somebody who's farming or on the ground in some capacity makes a big difference, because it it becomes a little bit of a different story,
Mm,
and it becomes more realistic, what it takes to do this. And I think there are a lot of people, we're kind of at a point where there are a lot of people advocating regenerative agriculture who don't have much experience with kind of the practical, tactical aspects of it and what it really
yeah.
takes to pull off. Um, so I think that helps. I mean, it's not like the most romantic answer, but
Yeah, I think
it's
it's
realistic.
great. I think it's great because most people are probably like 2 to 3. That's definitely on the low end, like 2 to 3 nodes away from their food production source, probably even more than that. And I think if you're buying directly from someone, like I love going to my farmer's market and trying to at least go weekly for a handful of things. And I think that that's just changed and shifted my perspective on food in a huge way, because you understand the process that they're going through to provide food, and the stakes that they're going up against on a day-to-day basis. And then also just, their livelihood is dependent on them providing very high quality food. So that's sort of
Yeah,
the expectation. Um,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's
And
a really important thing.
I think another thing is, understanding flavor a little bit better. There's
Mm,
so much nuance, and I mean, it's just so interesting, the different flavors that uh, a common food can present. Um, and they're that can be that can be done at the farmers market by getting to know farmers there or sampling products there. I'm a big fan of Dan Barber, uh, from Blue Hill and Stone
yeah.
Barns.
Yeah. He's up in New
And
York, right?
yep.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a more kind of high end experience,
Yeah.
but he's got a great book uh, that I think is pretty eye opening, just to kind of uh, what agriculture could look like from kind of a quality flavor based approach.
Yeah.
Um, and there's plenty of other people out there who are into it. I'm sure, wherever people are, there's a restaurant in their town that's doing kind of farm to table stuff.
Have you come across Mark Schatzker's work by any chance? He wrote The Dorito Effect, and
Yeah.
yeah, he kind of he got me down the thinking about how flavor is this incredible evolutionary tool towards guiding our nutritional wisdom, and also coming across Dan Barber and what was the documentary that he was in?
Chef's Table.
Chef's Table.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean the combination of those two, it's like, yeah, it does, like, intuitively, without opening up a textbook and reading about it, intuitively it makes sense that the food that tastes the best is generally the most nutritious.
Yeah. No, and it's really cool. I mean, he's Dan Barber's working with a seed company to develop new varieties based on flavor,
Oh wow.
and they're grown in a really um, well managed, kind of integrated way at Stone Barns. So it's just a cool look at what that paradigm could be. And
So cool.
there's plenty of other places doing that as well.
Yeah. So if you were to take a step back and look at the history of like how we've gotten here with big agriculture really coming into the picture in like the 70s and 80s, like how would you describe the history and how it's all gotten us to the position that we're in now?
Um, well, I think it's pretty complex. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I usually look at the two main areas: um, the Haber-Bosch method of synthetic nitrogen that was invented in the early 90s, and kind of became the source of all of our nitrogen fertilizer, and really changed agriculture uh, pretty dramatically.
Mm.
And that was kind of the start of chemical-based, high-yield-driven agriculture. And at the time, it was important because there were plenty of countries who were facing famine and in pretty precarious situations. And then not too long after that came the Green Revolution, kind of led by Norman Borlaug, who created all these hybrid varieties of wheat, corn, and rice that were high yielding and kind of more responsive and also dependent on these chemical fertilizers. And that created a whole cascading effect of ecological degradation. The burned up who knows how much soil carbon across the world, and really depleted the nutritional integrity of our food supply. So I think those are big ones, and it's hard to bring this up without thinking about all of the people who were fed as a result of this.
Mm.
Because it really, it changed the course of a lot of these countries, Mexico, India, who were basically under famine conditions, and, people had food.
Yeah.
But I think it just went a little bit too far in the wrong direction in terms of, chemical-based agriculture, industrialization.
Yeah, it seems like we're at the point in time where things are set to course correct, where we have the ability to feed people, but we also have now new impending problems that need to be resolved, or we're going to have a new bigger set of issues. I guess that's just how these things cycle. But how would you, if you were to draw up like your perfect picture for how regenerative agriculture grows into the future, what would that look like?
It's really got to be farm by farm. And like I said, it's very context dependent. And because of that, like I said, the application of the principles of it look different in each place.
Mm.
So it requires a lot of education, honestly. And people need to learn what it looks like in their exact context. And through doing that, I think the farms that have been able to do that most successfully then are able to propagate, what they've implemented and pass it on to, many people. I think Gabe Brown is an example of that. I mean, he's kind of a household name at this point.
Yeah.
Even for people who don't know anything about agriculture. And that's because he identified these principles and applied them in the, context appropriate way for his farm, and had great success. The problem I've seen is that people, instead of seeing the principle behind it, are trying to implement the practices and tactics that he used in a way that might not be context appropriate for them.
Right.
So I think it's just, one at a time, people doing it really well and understanding the way to do it, for their particular context, and then inspiring others.
Yeah. And I think that requires a bit of a grassroots movement when it comes to the educational component to it, taking action component to it. And I'm optimistic. You mentioned at the very beginning, like, find me a place where there's more hope, and kind of this optimism that, hey, we can fix these problems. Like, nature's a beautiful creature, and if we treat her right, like, these problems can be fixed. But it takes the intention to do it. We can't just keep going on the same course that we're on.
Right. Yeah. And that's the heart of it right there is, if we can harness the dynamism and power of nature, we can do so many things. And that's, kind of going back to what I was saying about getting down the basics before we, reach for these technological fixes.
Right.
And that's exactly what it is.
What are some of the common critiques of people who hear someone talking about incredible aspects of regenerative agriculture and all the positive externalities that would come from a world that's supported by like all these regenerative systems. I'm sure there's obviously scale is one that comes to mind, but is that one that you would consider, a common critique? And are there any others that come to mind?
Um, yeah, maybe scale, but I think more, I mean, one thing I hear more commonly is just that it's not supported by science, a lot of the claims.
Interesting.
Um, and that comes, I'm in a very kind of traditional agronomy world often. Um, so that's what those folks are often saying. Um,
In what
but
sense? Uh,
well, more in the sense of like there's not peer reviewed data
mm,
supporting supporting some of the claims.
gotcha.
And I think that's true, but also like if we were to limit ourselves to only reach for and kind of aspire to what's peer reviewed, we'd be in a pretty rough spot. I mean,
Yeah.
we need to innovate, and a lot of the stuff that's happening that's innovative is not happening in universities, and it's not happening, by the extension agents. It's farmers who are on the ground doing it,
Yeah.
and the fact that it's not peer reviewed, I mean, I think that's kind of um, I mean, it's just a weak argument, honestly.
Yeah. I think to me, it feels inappropriate to discount observational science from people who are working like yourself, or like a peer of yours might be doing day to day, month to month, and really seeing results. It's like the guy who goes to the gym and figures out a way that works for him. It's like, there, just because it's not some peer reviewed method doesn't mean that it's not working and that it can't be something that has immense upside if we do more research on it. And it also doesn't mean that we should stop doing it.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think it's something people ask me often, like, oh, well, show me a study. Um, and that's, sometimes I can because there's a study, but often I I don't have one because that's not what I do. I'm not a researcher, and
Yeah.
I'm not performing studies or trials. My job is to get results,
Right.
as quickly as possible, which can happen. I mean, I do it all the time. But yeah, so I think that's kind of the main one. And I do see that there are some claims that are maybe embellished a little bit. Um, you know, the claims of carbon sequestration, I think um, are a little bit embellished. I mean, I
Yeah.
think there's a great power in agriculture for sequestering carbon. There's a great possibility, but some of the claims, of reversing climate change, if you believe in that or not,
Yeah.
I don't. You never know when you're talking to people these days.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that's another thing that sometimes discredits regenerative agriculture. And
Yeah.
really, I don't. I'm not particularly inspired by that whole conversation. I think that if we were to talk about um, the other effects uh, of storing carbon in the soil, it's much more inspiring. I mean, what can be done to the water cycle? What can be done to the quality of our crops? Um, what 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 happens with biodiversity? All that stuff is um, linked to kind of the reversal of ecological degradation and all that, and carbon sequestration, but really is more kind of immediate.
Yeah. The carbon one is just like the most easy one for people to most marketable
Hmm.
benefit probably. So it's an easy one to kind of stand behind and try to use as your main argument. But like, I think the most compelling stuff is really like the water cycle, as you were saying, like some of the benefits there when you're seeing desertification across most farmland in a lot of different areas. It's like, how do we get water back into the soil? Well, we need to build these habitats back up.
Yeah, yeah, and nutrition. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like I said, all of these chronic diseases that cost billions of dollars to treat each year are linked to nutritional deficiencies.
Yeah.
And you were mentioning the study about the decline in nutrition. I mean, it's such low hanging fruit, and it's something that we can, something that each farm can be doing, no problem.
Right. Um, what have been some sources of inspiration for you? I know I was reading through your blog and you mentioned Wendell Berry, and I think some of his writing is incredibly inspirational. And I think he's opened up a lot of people's eyes to the world of low input farming and getting back to some of our roots in when it comes to just treating the land properly and being a good land steward. Is he one of them? And do you have any others?
Yeah, definitely. I love Wendell Berry. I think he kind of brings that aspect of like beauty,
Mm,
and um, kind of gives people a contact with agriculture in a way that a lot of people don't have. So I think he's great. And I mean, I just like how um, kind of rigid he is about some things, like how he doesn't have a computer. He refuses to get a computer, just has a landline. He's kind of a Luddite in a way,
right.
but it's kind of a beautiful life that he's made in doing that. So I think he's a great counterbalance to a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah, you need the
Um,
Wendell Berries of the world to balance out some of the other the other side of the equation.
yep, definitely. Um, and other stuff. I mean, a lot of the kind of early permaculture books, like the Permaculture Designer's Manual, was really influential on me, because it gave me a more kind of holistic lens to see things through,
Mm,
which I think is really important and really lacking. I mean, I think there's so much in the world that's kind of pulling us to see things in a much more reductionary way, and being able to kind of zoom out, see the whole system is pretty important. So that really shaped me. Um, Other people like William Albright, who's a
mm,
agronomist from, I think he was most prominent in the 1930s. Um, Came up with some really amazing stuff and started to link animal and human nutrition to soil. And he wrote several books and was really influential to people like Neil Kinsey, who's a pretty well-known agronomist. Um, so he's one, and there's a lot of stuff that I found influential that's from that time,
yeah.
1930s. There's stuff from even earlier that is just gold, but it was lost in that whole industrialization of agriculture that took place, right around that time, the 1930s. It just kind
Yeah.
of shifted the whole conversation, and that stuff was uh, largely lost. So it's
Yeah.
kind of wild to think that agriculture, being as important as it is, still some of the most influential, books and kind of teachings are from the early 1900s.
Right. Yeah. And do people discredit that when if it's not new age science or something that has been redone, retested, gone through iterations of like the academia, um, just looking at it and trying to figure out new ways to do it, or does it still
Yeah,
hold?
I mean, for some people, yeah, they're going to discredit it. And I've
Yeah.
like William Albright, he came up with this um, theory of base saturation,
Mm,
um, which is, I won't get too much into it. It's pretty technical, but
yeah.
it's very it's something that I use when looking at soils and making recommendations. And I think there's a lot of good there. But yeah, people discredit that all the time. But I've seen it to work really well.
Um, it kind of speaks to the system in a lot of ways where going back to what you were talking about with the peer-reviewed studies, that if there's not funding, like if there's not these companies who are have the budgets to spend on peer-reviewed studies for new developments, new technology, then this whole world of doing things in a more conservative approach is kind of just not getting nearly as much funding or attention, right? Like they're just
Yeah,
not getting the money to support some of these studies.
yeah, exactly. And that's, I mean, that's what's happened in the kind of land grant university system, is a lot of the funding is coming from the big, agrochemical companies, and that influences what's researched and what's focused on in those schools, which are pumping out the next generation of agronomists and professors and researchers. So I think that's a big issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Is one of the things that I saw on your blog that I needed to ask you about was one of the titles was "The End of Coffee is Near." And
Mm.
I think most people probably would hear that and go into panic mode. Uh, what was the inspiration for writing that, and what sort of context can you provide to the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of regret the title looking back, because I don't really think the end of coffee is near, but it is in peril to some degree.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, coffee production is really challenged really across the world. It's one of the it's typically farmers are getting paid less than what it costs to produce a crop,
Mm,
um, and there are a couple really severe diseases that are affecting coffee. It's the coffee tree lacks genetic diversity, which is an issue. So the couple diseases that are really prevalent have a pretty strong hold due to that lack of genetic diversity. But also, it's become one of the most chemically intense, agricultural systems.
mm,
Farmers are using dozens of different types of pesticides, and um, you know they're using herbicides, several different kinds of fungicides to deal with coffee rust, to really um, no avail. I mean, it's not really helping. Um, and at the same time, getting paid less and less for their crop. It's basically 100% manual in most places, manual
mm,
labor, from planting to managing to harvesting to processing. Other than in mostly Brazil is pretty mechanized. Um, and in a lot of countries, it's kind of the last standing tree cover is on coffee farms. And once
mm.
the coffee farms go, the trees go, and you see huge rates of deforestation, and it's pretty serious. Then changes the whole water cycle pretty dramatically, and yeah, so it's something. And then I guess another important aspect of it is that coffee is uh, compensated based on flavor. So
Mm,
one way out for these coffee farmers is to improve the quality of their coffee, which comes through healthier soil, better plant nutrition, and then they can be compensated really well for it. Um, and then the other thing I mentioned earlier, it lends really well to a agroforestry system, and it's it's something that most coffee farms aren't doing, and it's really something that it, if at all possible, they should do, because it adds a whole nother revenue stream, in terms of high value timbers, other fruits, even things like vanilla, turmeric, medicinal mushrooms, all these high value things that can be added to the system
mm.
to build in a little bit more redundancy and other revenue streams. So that's kind of been what I've been focusing on the last 6 or 7 years, is these coffee systems, and had some really good success, getting these coffee farms off of synthetic, uh, fertilizers and pesticides and the fungicides. And it's also just really beautiful. I mean, the whole process of growing coffee and processing it to the point where it can be roasted is really beautiful.
Yeah, it's a labor of love, I'm sure, that most people don't really understand unless they've done
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
What should the consumer know? Like, if they're buying coffee, is 100% organic good enough, or are there things that they should be aware of that you might just have better insight into when they're making those decisions?
Yeah. Um, so interesting. You mentioned organic coffee. The majority of coffee that I've seen that's organic is kind of organic by default because it's just not managed. Um, there are some bigger operations in Brazil that are organic, but they're mechanized and they've got the ability to do things like fertigation and kind of more high tech type agriculture stuff. So some of the best coffee that I've seen in terms of like a regenerative system is not certified organic,
Hmm.
mainly because it's just not really a recognized certificate, especially in the specialty coffee world.
Gotcha.
So you know, organic doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better or better managed or better quality. What does make a big difference is direct trade coffee.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of really good roasters who have direct trade relationships and are very transparent about it. So you can actually see what they're paying the coffee farm. Because otherwise, your standard coffee shop is using a broker who negotiates a price typically very low with the coffee farmer and then brokers it to the coffee shops and stuff like that.
Right.
So I would find a specialty roaster coffee shop who's doing direct trade. I've I've got a friend, Christopher Ferran from Phoenix Coffee in Cleveland, and I think he's kind of the gold standard in terms of this. He's
Hmm.
really works with coffee producers in a way that he adds a lot of value in terms of education and opportunities for them to innovate, pays them really well, and is completely transparent about it. So he publishes a transparency report,
Hmm.
which is really interesting and kind of gives some good guidelines as far as what to look for in other, coffee roasters or coffee shops.
That's really helpful because, again, I think people are probably trying to make the best decisions when it comes to it. And if it comes with better flavored coffee and coffee that is fairly represented across the food supply chain, I think it's a nice piece of information for people to take away from this combo. I saw on your site that you have, are you selling some sort of mineral supplements that are part of soil symbiotics?
Yeah. So soil symbiotics, that's my company where I do all my consulting and training, stuff like that. And then also we've got a side of the business which is products, and basically that came out of a need to have better tools to implement the systems that I was recommending or designing,
Hmm.
because there just weren't good tools. So I've got a couple partners who are much smarter than I am, who kind of drive that side of the business, the product development. And basically what we do is we custom blend different mineral amendments or mineral supplements, and then various biological inoculants and biostimulants. And that's kind of part of the program that we offer farmers. So we can, based off of soil data, sap, or tissue data, design a program that will, basically address what needs to be addressed
Hmm.
in a very customized way.
Gotcha. I was thinking that it
Yeah.
was like some form of like supplement for people's dietary supplementation when it comes to mineral deficiency. And I was going to ask, like, is there something you're seeing in the soil that is causing you to start thinking about like providing some sort of supplement, mineral supplement line for humans? But is that
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say we messed around with that a few years ago,
Yeah.
with kind of a fulvic based trace mineral supplement,
Yeah.
but it just tasted so bad that I couldn't really, like, I couldn't even get people to try it after.
Right.
I mean, they would try it, but they wouldn't
Yeah.
take it a second time because it tasted so bad. And there's other stuff out there, and I think that's, I take stuff like that because I think our food is just devoid of all that stuff,
Yeah.
for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah. I recently started taking a trace mineral supplement, and I was Mr. like anti-supplementation for a while, like try to eat your way out of the nutrient deficiencies and mineral deficiencies. But the more I kept reading about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Morley Robbins, and there's a
Oh
few other
yeah.
people who
Yeah.
talk about mineral deficiencies. And I'm like, there's no way I'm getting nearly enough magnesium, and copper is another one in
Yeah.
my diet. Are those things
Yeah.
that you see in the soil too? Is it like magnesium, copper that are two big minerals that are deficient in the soil?
I mean, they can be. It depends on kind of the underlying geology of the soil
Yeah.
and the history of, how things have been treated and amended and all that.
Mm,
But definitely, definitely can be limiting factor. And really, it's also a matter of the antagonisms between different minerals. So, an excess of nitrogen, for example, will um, create different antagonisms between other minerals so that they're not taken up by the
yeah.
plant. Magnesium is one of those.
Mm,
Um, so that's another thing. And I just went down the Morley Robbins rabbit hole recently, and it's really interesting because a lot of what he talks about is very much relevant to soil and the way that minerals kind of move and react with each other in the soil. So it's
mm.
always cool to find stuff that's connected in that way.
Yeah. Connected, but in a different sphere than what you're working in.
Exactly. Yeah.
What would you, is kind of like a final remark or final note, what would you say to kind of the average person if you wanted to get like a message out there when it comes to talking about regenerative agriculture and what people should be thinking about?
Um, that's a tough one. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff out there for people to kind of learn learn the basics, kind of get their feet wet and see the importance of it.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there's a lack of really good technical information onto in terms of like how to achieve a regenerative agriculture.
Mm,
And I think one of the things that's getting in the way of that is just kind of the dogma that's starting to kind of bubble up around regenerative agriculture. So, keeping an open mind and really studying the basics of what drive healthy soil and healthy plants.
mm.
And, you know, you can achieve a lot by doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I think that's it's really the only way out of the current predicament is being able to keep an open mind. I feel like you've probably experienced that firsthand with how you've approached things. And then as this movement grows, it needs to continue to grow with that mindset of evolving and adapting to the different factors that are going to be presented along the way. And I think the work that you're doing is amazing. I found a ton of value out of just going through your blog and reading some of the articles that you've put out there. Is there a good place for people to find you on the internet outside of the blog and your Twitter?
Yeah. So, yeah, the blog is a good place. I'm writing more and more on that. That's sknowlton.com, and starting a newsletter where I'll share current writing and other interesting things. Um, my business website is soilsymbiotics.
Mm,
That's a good place to kind of learn about what I'm doing there. And yeah, Twitter. I kind of mess around on Twitter a little bit, and always happy to meet new people and have conversations. So people can reach out to me there. Um, and then Soil Symbiotics on Instagram is also another place. You can see photos from a lot of the farms that we've worked with, and a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I think the information is hugely valuable, especially as people try to just come to terms with getting a better education on the food system. And a lot of the chronic diseases, as you touched on out there, are directly related to what's happening in the soil. So I think hopefully that at least that message gets out there a little bit louder, so people like yourself will continue to have a strong voice. And let us know what we can do to help in terms of getting your message out there, because I've loved just getting to educate myself more on some of your work.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for coming on again. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot.